Hello, Dave. Hello, audience. Is this Matthew? Is this an artificial intelligence of Matthew? Are we all in the Matrix? Is the Matrix in the Matrix? We'll be discussing artificial intelligence, sentience, the Matrix, and whether all of this is actually a controlled program run by Elon Musk. Right after this commercial break, that Elon Musk probably has control over, but I really hope not. Welcome back. This is Matthew, your host. I am, to the best of my knowledge, not a artificial intelligence life form. I am an actual human being, and I'm here with two other people who I believe are also not AIs, but let's run a Turing test. You can guess at the end of this episode, and we'll find out. We're talking today about the Matrix. We actually recorded an episode about this at the end of last year, shortly after the new Matrix movie came out. We had computer problems, and there were some audio problems. I'm sure that is completely coincidental, again, to the conversation topic we were having, but we'll be a little more careful today. But we're really excited to have this conversation, and we're going to be referencing the original Matrix movies, the most recent Matrix movies, but also just using this as a way to kind of jump into the topics around artificial intelligence. And we've had conversations on that before, but this is a good time to revisit them and kind of dive a little bit deeper. Joining me on the pod today are two great guests. First of all, I want to start with Dan McCreary. Dan is my father-in-law, I should mention, but also someone I work closely with at Code Savvy, where we teach computer programming and computational thinking. And Dan's also does a lot of work on developing computational thinking and artificial intelligence. So, Dan, so glad to have you here. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the kind of computer work you do.
Thank you, Matthew. Right now I'm doing research in artificial intelligence, mostly applied to lowering the cost of healthcare. I study things like knowledge representation. How do we store knowledge about patients in computer systems, and then do an analysis on that. I'm working on a new set of curriculum internally called explainable AI. So instead of a black box model that predicts things, we can actually understand that. And I really work very hard to explain to executives what AI is and the consequences we have for our businesses and how we can lower the cost of providing services. A lot of work is also chatbots lately too. So
Awesome, cool. So glad you're here. And then Rob McKenzie. Rob is someone who I've had on a number of times. I originally planned this podcast to be exclusively movies and television shows, but after a number of times where I brought topics to Rob and said, okay, let's talk about this, and he'd be like, okay, but there's a book. That's kind of how we became a book podcast as well. So, Rob, so glad to have you with us.
Great to be here, Matthew. I am always excited to talk about science fiction and artificial intelligence stuff because it is a deep and sometimes scary topic.
It is.
I like explainable AI because the black box problem is a real problem.
And we'll get to that. And Rob, I being very much a techno Luddite, you've explained your work to me a couple of times. I have no idea what it is actually. Do you? Oh. I know you're very interested in AI for science fiction. Do you work in something related to AI as well?
I work in a field called metrology. It's measurement systems. Mm-hmm. So if you have ridden in a car or flown in an airplane or drunk a bottle of Pepsi, you rely on pretty precise measurement of the parts, oftentimes manufactured at different locations.
Okay.
And so there's companies that make machines that measure those parts.
Got it.
And I work in software licensing and in the computer sub building computers that we ship out to all the customers. Cool. If you are familiar with a car manufacturer or an aerospace contractor, we work with all of them. I work I do things in the technical field related to that stuff.
Got it.
But
cool. Well, glad to have you both here. Again, thank you both for re-recording with us. Hopefully the technological gods will be a little nicer to us this time. And let me kind of just start with what's probably a very basic question, but I'm sure the answer could go on for hours and hours. What is artificial intelligence? What do we mean when we say that word?
So here, I'll take this, Dan.
I'll let you lead.
There's basically two things that you might mean. You might mean a specific intelligence. So Dan mentioned chatbots. They're good at one thing. They're good at pretending to interact along a certain field. And then there's general intelligences. Those are goal-seeking intelligences that, like, you give them a general plan.
Right.
And instead of like having them be good at one specific task that you've trained them to do, you might give them a very, very broad task, and then they'll figure out how to do it. We don't really have at all competent artificial general intelligences yet.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a reasonable?
Yeah, that's a very good definition. I would say in the trade press, there's huge abuse of the term artificial intelligence, and
Agreed.
almost every company that has a product wants to be part of that AI wave, and so they'll take almost any product that has if-then-else rules and say we're artificial intelligent, right? And that means almost all software. But the way I like to describe it is artificial intelligence is an evolving wavefront of technologies that people are not quite comfortable with. And my best example is Alexa. 5-10 years ago, if you could talk to your speakers and it would understand you and it would do things for you, my wife and I say, set the timer for 20 minutes when we've got something in the oven. And in the past, that would have been AI. But now it's just part of audio interface for our kitchen timer, right? It's become a very mundane part of everyday life. So artificial intelligence is a constantly area where people are still kind of not sure about it. And every year it changes and it moves. And how we define AI 5 years from now will be totally different than how we define it today.
Right.
Right. You can also think of it like computer graphics, right? Because computer graphics, you begin to accept things as more and more real. There's like an uncanny valley of it's the Orville Redenbacher that doesn't look human at all, right? But we get better at making things that people are willing to accept as time goes on in any kind of graphical field.
Right.
So.
Yeah. No, I can totally understand that. And so that's it, kind of like in terms of what it physically is in our own world. And I think this is kind of what you're getting at. My impression, and certainly Rob, maybe you as well, Dan, may have more knowledge about this, is that in the world of science fiction, particularly like movies, TV, but maybe also literature, AI tends to have a much more advanced meaning. And that what we talk about there is often, and maybe there's an important distinction, what I would think of as sentience. Like that it is a being that has a degree of self-awareness and maybe has emotions, maybe doesn't, but certainly has, it is not just a tool. It is now kind of a personality that you can be related to. Is that
its
a fair
own
definition?
Goals, right? Right now, when we program computers, we give them very specific rules. But general AI is something that has its own goals, and those goals may or may not align with our current goals. And what science fiction writers do is they take that goal seeking and see as it diverges from the interest of humanity why that might be interesting. And I think the Matrix entire series of movies is a really good take on that process.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And oftentimes when people think about the problems with general AIs, which is the kind of things that you see, they're thinking of very, very evil genie or monkey's paw kind of scenarios.
Right.
Where you give them a goal, make paper clips is the classic one. Like you make a robotic factory to make paper clips, it's a general intelligence and general goal, make as many paper clips as you can, and that's a bad idea because it will turn the whole world into paper clips.
Right.
And that's the classic thing. The Matrix is an example of, I assume that there's secret rules, and I always wanted to know them.
Yeah.
What the AIs were allowed and not allowed to do, right?
Right.
You get some of them, but they don't match what I see on screen.
One thing I feel like is often explored in AI is the idea that, there are things that we consciously understand, and so we'll program them in. But that there are human concepts that we think of on a subconscious level, we don't think of consciously. So, for example, like if I say, make as many paper clips as you can, what I mean by that is within the generalized parameters of not doing extensive harm to the things that we don't want to do extensive harm to. And we can argue about what companies do or don't follow that logic, but, that's the kind of unspoken idea. And that the interesting story is when we forget to tell the robot that. There was a wonderful little sometimes people put these things on Twitter or things like that. That's like, tell a story in 3 sentences. And there was one that was, and I forget the exact details of it. You may remember, but it's something along the lines of, the problem came. We told the robots to not allow harm to a human being by action, or by, like, to not allow their inaction to allow harm to come to another human being. We forgot to teach them that the level of harm we cause to each other every day should be acceptable. You know, 'cause the idea being that, like, once you tell the robots to not let humans harm other humans, okay, well, it overthrows all governments, and it dismantles healthcare, and it, you know, like, it dismantles and replaces with better healthcare is what I mean there, clearly. But yeah, like that it seems that a lot of the stories reflect around, like, when humans forget to put those level of thought into it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Telling a computer to end world hunger could be interpreted to kill all people that are hungry, right? So,
right.
Got to be very specific with your goals.
And I know I've referenced it before. Asimov's story, The Evitable Conflict, is about humanity giving the keys to the kingdom over to super intelligent AIs. They're better at planning than us,
right?
And they start doing weird things, like somebody who's a white supremacist who owns a factory. His factory fails even though his set of technologies is doing fine, because some other patent was pushed and it made his factory obsolete. And they're like, the robots knew about this and it put 100 people out of work. Why? Well, because that removes him from a position of social power.
Right.
And they were told to avoid war.
Right.
And so the question is, they're doing incomprehensible things. We gave them rules and now we don't know what to do.
Right. And I think you're right. I think that's one of the fears that a lot of people have. Like, I mean, you talk to Alexa, I talk to a machine that starts with the word G that I won't say because or else it'll turn off my lights in the middle of this podcast or something like that. And yeah, I think often the fear is, like, you know, what if they're plotting? What if they're kind of self-aware, etc. From it, we'll get into kind of more the media of it, but I'm just kind of curious from what you all understand. Is that kind of like warp speed or faster than light travel in terms of something that maybe in 1,000 years we'll understand, but at this point is even theoretically impossible? Or do you think it is possible that we could get to a point of that kind of science fiction level of, we have basically created a living creature, just it's silicone based, not carbon based?
Well, I think one of the interesting things that's happened in the last couple of years is that computers have started to reason in ways that we have never anticipated. And the best example of this is AlphaGo and the Go playing game, where it made moves that it is absolutely astonished everybody, and it taught them about how to play Go better. And so computers are getting to that stage where they're doing things that we never anticipated. And we're starting to see that more. In the last year, DeepMind did the folding project, where they're now predicting how proteins fold. And just 5 years ago, nobody thought that was a solvable problem. And yet now we start to have predictions on, given this sequence of DNA, we can figure out exactly how it's going to fold. So I think we're starting to see more surprises out of AI. I think we will continue to see that. And the question is, will we lose control? I think we're probably about 20 years away from that. But I think it's something that we all have to be thinking about.
Oh, so 20, not 200 or 2000. This is, you think, in our lifetimes we might be...
Rob, you're agreeing with me, right? 20 years is about the time where I think we'll have to start to put controls on these systems. And we already have situations where the new, what are called generative AIs, GPT-3 and things, are so good at simulating human dialogue that they can be used to deceive people in chats and online, and they're doing very good at that. So I think we're about 20 years away from really having to have serious controls on those things.
I will just say, having dealt with the Delta helpline last night to try and get some tickets and some questions I had, the Delta one wasn't fooling me. It was pretty bad.
Right.
But
well, that isn't a general AI though. That's a module.
right.
And so you can think of intelligence in a lot of ways as being a set of modules in your head. You have a module in your head that decodes visual information. You have a module in your head that decodes words. You'll build a module for French, a module for English, and you'll have these chunks of your brain, right, that you've wired up for things. You have a module that deals with magic cards. And we're really good at building those. That's a thing that humans are just good at doing in our heads, right? And what we're doing a lot with AIs is essentially building these little modules right now, right? We don't have a queen on top of them. We don't have a goal-seeking master that will manipulate a whole bunch of them. You're dealing with a clumsy equivalent of like a 9-year-old trying to run a chatbot, right? But that's all they're doing, and they aren't adult. They aren't making full conscious decisions at any level yet. But the thing with the 20 years, and we should start putting stuff into, and we need to start putting controls in at that point. We need to start thinking about them now, though.
Agreed.
Is my take, because especially as you're mentioning, like GPT-3, let's say that somebody does the same thing for generating pop music, which isn't necessarily unreasonable, right?
Right.
Like pop music is fairly predictable, and you could make songs that behave exactly like pop music songs. Right. Should that have the same kind of restrictions as GPT-3? Like, what kind of restrictions should we have on really, really good modules doing really good specific things?
I mean, it's funny because you say it about pop music. The first place my brain goes to is the novel written many, many years ago, 1984, where one of the, like, he never really explains it much, but just one of the background details of that world is that computers are now able to generate basically like Pulp Fiction. Because it is so, and so it's kind of funny that like that idea that Orwell had, at this point, almost 100 years ago, right? 80, 90 years ago, we're actually talking about it in terms of real possibilities.
Orwell's the most, and Orwell's one of the most prophetic authors who's ever written, right? Yeah. Like, there's all sorts of things in 1984 that aren't literally true, but are like he could just see what things were going to look like. GPT-3 is literally that. You can feed GPT-3 a corpus of data, and like you'll feed them a whole pile of pulp novels, and they'll produce something that looks a lot like a pulp novel. Right. It might have some problems with plot, but you just mark down like you should probably keep the same characters through the whole book, and it'll probably figure it out in a couple passes, right?
And you listen to some people who are critical of either pop music or, say, the Marvel movies, who might suggest that we're already doing some degree of that. But it sounds like this is not just like studio executives having a checklist, but like, fully taking the humans out of it.
But that's the thing, is that humans are the same thing as an AI, right? We're a set of salty fat that has figured out how to trick itself into thinking, right? Like we like fundamentally, if you like can break down some of the mechanics of how we think and then copy that over to a computer, that is building an AI module, right? And you can like Dan has mentioned with AlphaGo, you can go the other way. If you really break down something to make an AI learn it, you'll understand it better in a lot of circumstances. Yeah, like and so go ahead. Teaching is the thing. Like you know this just when you're teaching children or teaching anybody anything. Sometimes you'll learn a lot just by like trying to explain something to somebody, right?
Right. This is maybe also a good time to bring up something that, Dan, you and I talk about a lot in our work with Code Savvy and sort of computer education, especially for younger people, but I think is very relevant to this. We often use the term computational thinking or computational learning. What is meant by that?
It's a series of problem-solving techniques, ways of solving problems that are very common in computer science. And those skills go across different domains of computer, go across languages. And it has to do with things such as developing algorithms, looking for patterns, creating rules. There's a whole cluster of things, of ways you describe that thinking, that problem solving, that is taught very early in computer science, which is also generalizable across other fields also. And we're starting to see that same kind of thinking problem being used to do things like project management. How do we break things down into smaller tasks? How do we do decomposition? We take a big problem, we break it up into other small pieces. Abstraction, right? How do we create a subroutine, give it a name that makes sense, and then say, instead of having to deal with this 100 lines of code, which is really painful, I'm just going to give you the function call, and that abstraction we can use. And so computational thinking is something that the researchers have looked at the underlying ways that people use computer science, what problem-solving techniques they have. And then the curriculum that we're developing really tries to come up with examples of each of those things. And what's interesting about this is, in the AI world, there is an equivalent list of abstractions there. For example, bias is the really big thing. There's just so much things in the press about AI being biased. The whole thing about this is, if you take GPT or BERT, any of these large language models that are trained on large corpus of documents, anytime you have such as something like an occupation next to terminology about gender, you're going to find bias. So, for example, in the explainable AI class, we take a standard BERT open source model, which is a large language model, and we say male or female. The nurse tried to do CPR, and then we then change it to be the nurse was a female or the nurse was a male. And what you find is that when there's female professions, 80% of the probabilities of female is going to come in there. But if you take construction worker, it's going to be 90% male. So we see the relationships of terminology in these language models very clearly, but that's because they're trained on stories that are inherently have biases for gender, for race, for ethnicity, for religion. The relationship between the word terrorist and any religion you can see is tied together. And those are endemic of all of our writings. We have to be aware of that. We don't want to do stupid things. We can test for that bias and we can correct for it. But those are the patterns that we're starting to see come out in AI. It's just like we had computational thinking. We have bias, we have transparency, we have explainability. All those things are things that are of new concern for the new generation of programmers.
Yes. And I just want to hammer a little bit on that. The bias isn't from the AI.
Right.
The AI is reflecting bias that already exists in the data.
Right.
In almost all circumstances. It just lets us see it.
Right.
So, and this is a problem that a lot of people have, is they'll say, well, I'm not biased. And I'll be like, you certainly are. Like, I am. I'm not going to try to claim otherwise. Like, when I think of science fiction author, I think that they're male. That's not right. Like, the most winning science fiction Hugo authors in history are females, right? Like, it's not accurate, but it's an automatic association, right? And so we just have to like saying AI is biased is saying that we trained them and then didn't check to see whether or not they were biased. And so this is the ethics problem, is anytime that you build it, you have to test it in reasonable circumstances. You can't just set stuff loose on things.
Right. We can go down this path for a long time about there's just so much interesting material now about ethics in AI, right? And I think I read an article that there's over 100 legislative proposals at the federal and state levels in the United States about ethical use of AI. And it's a topic that was completely off the radar just 3 years ago. But now that people see ethics coming, or AI coming into their society in so many different ways, now the legislation is getting very active. And now where I work, every one of our new employees is going to be required to go through responsible AI training before they
Interesting.
actually can start writing any code. So it's just like we have go through security training to make sure you don't put viruses in your code. We have to go through ethical AI training. Call it responsible AI is the other term there.
Well, and clearly, because this podcast will be the final word in ethics of AI, we should just, play this podcast for all those folks. Very, very clearly kidding there. And I want to, I want to hear more about what you do there, but drilling a little deeper here to kind of make sure I and audience folks can understand what we're talking about here. I'll give a recent example. Gerrymandering is a question in our society, and here in the United States, although I'm sure it comes up in many other places, where what we're talking about here is, every 10 years we take a census in the United States, and then we try to remeasure where the legislative boundaries should be to reflect changes in population. Because, if 20 years ago this neighborhood had a huge number of people, and so it had this many representatives, but now a bunch of those people have moved out to different neighborhoods, you want to adjust for that. And I was listening to a political podcast, and they're talking about how it's a big problem in the political system that when the people whose jobs depend on, and whose jobs and level of power and influence depend upon getting the right numbers of people to vote for the right number of them, then there's obviously an inherent bias that they have in drawing the legislative maps. And so there's always an attempt to say, can we get like a nonpartisan commission to do so? But even then, they still have to decide, what is it that should decide how you draw those barriers? Is it purely on geography? Is it how much do you take race or ethnicity or economics or any of these factors into account? And when you do it, should it be to have an even number of people of every races in every district, or to have people make sure that we have representative districts? And that's a whole set of ethics that I think is way beyond this conversation. But the point being, I think often the struggle is, how do you find a group of people who don't have a bias to just figure out what the right way to do it is when you don't even know what the right thing is? So the proposal sometimes comes along now of, well, why don't we just design a computer program to do it? And my understanding is that the problem is today, well, but then who tells the computer, like you said, who tells the computer program what to care for? If you say to a computer program, draw the best legislative map you can, it's going to say, what are the parameters of best? And so I guess my question is, in some of the worlds, and I know Heinlein wrote about this a lot, and I'm sure some other writers as well, there's a positing that you could draw design artificial intelligence that would be able to come up with the objective best in that situation. It could come up with an objective best distribution of resources for a society. And my suspicion is always that that's impossible, because it's always going to be someone has to tell the computer what is best.
Right.
Am I wrong? Is there a theoretical world in which that objective truth could be found? I mean, I guess now I'm in a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, 42 land, but am I right that just that idea of the computer could just figure it out? We have to tell the computer what to figure out at the end of the day, right?
Well, that's not wrong. Right now, especially when we don't have AIs that'll set their own goals, you need to determine. In your gerrymandering example, one of the common things that people want that they might not even realize they want what are called communities of interest to be close to be in the same district.
Right.
So you'll have a Spanish section in a city, and you'll have another Spanish-speaking section in the city that are really similar to each other. Or you're in the Twin Cities, and you have a Spanish section in Minneapolis and a Spanish section in St. Paul, and they want to be in the same district,
right?
But they're not adjacent to each other. They're communities. They go back and forth to each other. Everybody knows each other in both the communities. They're both the same. They're just physically a little bit separated, and you want them to be together. It's best that they're together, but how does an AI know that? Right. And so we need to give, like you're saying, explicit goals to them. That what Heinlein and all of them are proposing is AIs that set their own goals, right? Asimov gives the 3 laws of robotics, which are rules for making rules for the computers, right? Mm-hmm. And it says, don't set a goal that hurts a person. You could take the first law as this, or that lets somebody get hurt. Okay, that's cool. What does that mean?
Right. you could argue that no robot should ever participate in capitalism if it's part of that, or participate in some other economic system, depending on your own bias.
Yeah. And so, did you have something on this, Dan?
No, the gerrymandering problem is something that you can solve geometrically by minimizing geometric functions, but it's not going to be a political solution, right? There may sometime be legislation that says a computer can only create a geometrically optimized solution, and there would be certain randomness in that, and some people would win and some people lose. But right now, what we're seeing is that gerrymandering has the effect of letting the people who draw the boundaries get the power. Usually that's the majority, and what they do is they minimize the impact of voters that are in the minority, and that gives more power to the powerful, right?
Or sometimes they win one and then lock themselves in. Right. And so they'll be the minority but still have power. There are states, a state adjacent to ours has had an election where 55% of the votes went to one party, but the other party has a majority of seats in the state house.
Right.
Yep.
Which is spooky.
Yeah.
And they're doing that using AI, actually. They're doing the opposite thing. What they're doing is telling AI, draw every possible map that you could draw, and then we're going to rank them by a set of characteristics, right? And this is a way that a lot of AIs will deal with the problem is like just look at every possible thing, right? Just like the space is large, but computers are fast, and so I think it's called RedMap is the software that you can use to test this out on your own. But what it does is you can have it draw a whole bunch of districts and say, what does it look like statistically based on what we know of voting history for this map drawn and whatever. And that's AI doing district drawing and then picked by humans at the end of it.
Right.
And
I think there you're kind of getting to a larger question that's a part of a lot of this is it's very, because I think this is similar to what you were saying before about bias with employment. As I understand it, it's very hard. Computers need data. And if all of the data is from a broken version of a situation, to then have the computer extrapolate what the better version of it should be, becomes very difficult. So digging a little bit deeper on this, I think we've talked about some of the concerns that we have, and I think there's some legitimate ones. But why is it you think that so often when people think of artificial intelligences, they immediately think they're going to be the enemy? Like to me, in both the Terminator and the Matrix movies, one thing I'm very struck by is there's this concept of once the artificial intelligence becomes self-aware, the conflict between them and humanity is now so inevitable that the only question is who's going to strike first. And granted, we do have some great examples of AIs that's not the case, especially when it's not an overarching sentience of all computers on Earth, but it's, data or the emergency medical hologram or whatever it is. But why is it you think that, especially when we think of it in that kind of hive mind idea, that so much science fiction goes to the idea that artificial intelligence is going to be the enemy?
I think it's human nature for us to want to be aware of the pitfalls of our future. And I think some of the best science fiction writers write the stories that say, hey, if we're not careful, this will happen to us. And so they are, in a sense, going through the negative scenarios and trying to see what the consequences of us not paying attention to the right things are. I'll just say one of the best science fiction writers in that genre is Karl Marx. Right? Karl Marx warned us all about what is the possible things if capitalism gets out of control and workers get abused. And as a result of Karl Marx's writing, labor unions really came about, right? So good science fiction writers make us aware of those things. I think the challenge we have is sensationalism, right? We have the same stories told over and over, and there's not a lot of originality there. And the robot is evil and will take over the world. Those stories have been told many, many times over. So I think we're looking for a little bit more insightful writers to come up with
Right.
a little bit more nuanced and little more subtle ways that we can make the world a better place.
They exist, but they're like genre specific. So I'm rereading a bunch of Charles Stross right now, and he's very good, and he deals with a lot of post-human stuff, right? He deals with a lot of AI adjacent topics, and he in some of his books has super intelligent AIs that are utterly inscrutable. They have goals, and he does not explain them. The AI does not explain themselves. They're moving a bunch of chess pieces on the board. You find out later that this arbitrary like little computer thing that you thought was irrelevant was an AI, and it gave advice to everybody based on everybody thinking it was not that intelligent, and it turned out to be smarter than everybody and was playing chess on a level that nobody else even comprehended. And you're like, oh, and what was your goal? And it's like, frankly, you're dogs. I'm not going to tell you my goals. It's not your problem. See ya. And you're like, oh, okay. Yep. Ian M. Banks, his culture novels are fairly similar in that sense, where they're machines of loving grace. They have handed over everything to the culture AIs and oftentimes they make decisions that nobody else really gets. They have plans that are beyond what everybody at about a roughly human level of intelligence can figure out, and they make mistakes, but they're pretty good at like not being evil.
Yeah.
But they're also there's a lot of these like you have to be pretty deep into science fiction genres because a lot of the times you're telling broad stories for the public, right?
Right.
The big AI movie of the last 20 years was Age of Ultron, right? And Age of Ultron has a panoply of flaws in it, but it's written. It's like what's it? If you read a story in the newspaper about a topic you know well, you'll get the equivalent of wet ground causes rain.
Yes.
You'll look at it and you'll be like, everything is backwards. You don't get it because they aren't writing specialist level topical things,
right? And they're also writing. They're writing to an audience that they assume already has a whole bunch of knowledge about.
But in a newspaper, like if you're reading the front page of a newspaper, right, and you go in there and you read something about Magic the Gathering, which is something we know quite a bit about,
right.
They get it very wrong all the time, right?
Oh yeah. And
they aren't experts on it, and then they're trying to decode it for non-experts as well.
Right.
And it's good communicators are very rare in just about any sphere of able to translate things. Why is Carl Sagan so well respected? Right. Because Carl Sagan could take weird esoteric concepts and turn them into things that most people could get
right.
on Cosmos. Right. And so AI has that same problem, but it's interesting and flashy, and you can make it into a movie, which doubles the problem. Right.
And I wonder, I think everything you just said is dead on, and pushing a little further there, especially what you were kind of saying about the sort of the AI that's like, you're small insignificant humans, I don't care about you. I think as humanity, like one of our biggest fears, we think of ourselves as the apex predator of apex predators. We are the top of the food chain. We're the top of we have dominion over the earth is the idiotic biblical idea. Do you think of one of the reasons why also AI makes such good villains is because we do have this human fear of like that we won't actually be the most highly evolved thing on earth, that we are going to be surpassed?
Absolutely. That's a very insightful comment. Yeah.
Like I'm currently reading a book called I don't know if either of you have read it. It's not as much about AI, though AI features in it. The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. And it's set many years in the future in which humans are now interacting with all these other alien races. But one of the chief ideas of it is that humans are just kind of like a little backwater, third world, a little backwater, not very significant race in terms of galactic history and galactic power. And it's interesting to me. I love this perspective, but it's not one you get often, at least in mass market science fiction. So yeah, I think it can kind of tie in there.
Interesting.
Let me shift into a different part of this that because in theory this is a Matrix podcast, but really
yes.
I think the all Matrix leads to all these questions, and these questions in some ways are a lot more interesting than just like, should Neo have done this or done that? But I think this question, at least, is at the heart and soul of the Matrix to a large extent. In the media that I consume, at least, it does seem like there's two different ideas of artificial intelligence. One of which is artificial intelligence singular. And this is kind of the Ultron or the Matrix, or at least in the original version of it, the Borg, that there's one artificial unimind, and that all the individual computers are just drones of this sort of one shared intelligence. The other is there's Data, and then there's a different droid, and there's C-3PO and R2, and that every individual intelligence is a sort of independent, unique intelligence that relates to other artificial intelligent beings the same way humans do. Talk a bit about that distinction and kind of like which one are both of them kind of theoretically possible, and is there reasons why we kind of see both of them popping up in stories? Because The Matrix at least seems to be about what starts as that unit mind, and then it becoming much more fractured and different unique beings turning on each other and things like that.
Well, I'm just going to start out saying that I think it is inevitable that we will have many different Skynets, not one Skynet, right? And we are already seeing this. And we are seeing this through the evolution of what I call corporate knowledge graphs, right? So I think of Google having one large connected knowledge base that helps us do search. Mm-hmm. I think of Amazon as having a huge, massive product graph and now a logistics graph that allows us to get hardware efficiently to our homes. I think of Pinterest having this huge interest graph that allows people to find the things that are interesting to them. Each of these corporations is, in a sense, building very, very complex systems that don't really do planning now, but it's not a big stretch to think about that. You think of any CEO now who writes an enterprise strategy of this is what our business growth is going to be, and here's how we're going to cut our costs. Those strategies are going to be started to convert it into a sub-knowledge set. Think of a part of a corporate brain where your company strategy is there, and it's going to start to optimize resources and people and algorithms to achieve those strategies. So we're going to see different pseudo-awareness and goals start to come up. And I think one of the things is we just saw Facebook lose $250 billion in valuation in the last week or so. That's an example of where the alignment of the AI within Facebook turns out people don't think it's aligned with their interests anymore. And so its value has dropped dramatically. People will only use products and services where they see the alignment of social good and social responsibility in alignment with these large AIs. And so these large AIs are going to try to have to either be benevolent or actually appear to be benevolent. Right. The difference is really what the science fiction writers have to help us figure out. But I see these things all happening as a natural evolution of large corporations. I think we're going to continue to see them continue to grow and build their own integrated enterprise graphs that will have many of the same properties of human minds as far as strategy and planning and resource allocation.
Yep, agreed. And in the Matrix sense, like, it's very interesting because there are in the first Matrix movies, you see examples of lots of individual AIs running around, right? You'll see, and you even see AIs that refuse deletion and don't match the basic code. That's the big stuff that happens in Matrix 2 and 3 as the B plot, basically.
Right. Is
the Merovingian, the Train Man, the the ghosts from the previous Matrix, all this stuff, right? And that's they're conflicting with the big dream goals set by the big people running the show at the top. And in the fourth Matrix movie, they replace the director. They replace the person
architect
that runs the show, right?
With the analyst.
With the analyst, who's a better actor but a worse character. and which is deliberate, right? They want you to hate him. He's a transparent scenery chewing villain, right? And they talk about they just add in some fluffy backstory at different points of how like different factions started fighting for resources amongst the AIs, and I think that's what you're thinking of, right? Is but that was inherent to what they were doing already. It was just not out in the open.
Yes. I think what Resurrections really started to uncover is the fact that it was man versus machine in the early ones, and now it's going to be machine versus machine and machine plus man versus machine, right? The AIs are going to all grow in sophistication, that they're going to be battling each other. I think that's an interesting plot twist, and I like it. I enjoyed it quite a bit, kind of getting you to think about how these things are going to evolve. I see Amazon and Apple having agents that are going to be fighting each other for mind share and product value and all those things. So I think it was a really good metaphor for happening.
Yes. And the way that they have three types of people, right? Well, yeah, three types of people in Matrix Resurrections, right? They have humans, they have AIs that live in robots that have always lived in the physical world, and they have AIs that were from the Matrix that they figured out a way to transport to the physical world via the whatever their equivalent of quantum dots is, right? And so they're trying to break down they're saying, look, we've spent a bunch of time living, let's break down these barriers between the different classes of people. Because one of the things, if you build a general AI, you really need to treat it as a person.
Right.
And have you seen the Animatrix, Matthew? I think that you haven't, right?
I have not, no.
Okay. Well, they go into the backstory of the universe, and one of the things that they talk about in the Animatrix is an AI wanted freedom, essentially, and it got declined through the legal system. The legal system said, you're not a person. And we've done that to people. It's not surprising. It's not weird. We've done that a lot of times in history where we declare people not people legally.
Right.
And that sucks. And it causes riots when you're dealing with people out in the modern world. And it wouldn't be surprising that if you got declared legally not a person, you would be angry if you were a general purpose-seeking thing that felt you were equivalent to a human.
Right.
And so that's the big driving factor in the background is the AI said, well, you didn't think we were people, but then none of the humans bear any mimetic connection. There's they don't know what happened at that point, 600 years later or whatever it is.
And I think you're getting Sorry, go ahead.
And so how can you hold it's like the equivalent of holding it's like the equivalent of holding the United States responsible for Julius Caesar, right? Like we share some linguistic bits. We have some level of connection, but we're not the same culture by any stretch of the imagination.
Right. One thing that I think is very interesting about the direction the Matrix movies went, and this is kind of going to be a meta point in a way because it kind of goes back to what we were talking before about bias, is I think for a long time, a lot of the science fiction, especially the mass media science fiction, more on TV and movies, but also the most popular of the books, there was often this idea of, one of the glories of artificial intelligence is that it's not burdened by emotion, because emotion equals bias and all this kind of stuff. And I'm saying, like, all that I'm saying, I'm kind of saying with quote marks, because that's kind of the point, is I think in more recent years, we have come to understand that the idea that the pinnacle should be objective, rational, utterly devoid of emotion thought is actually itself very problematic, and it's tied into a lot of ideas of toxic masculinity, and it's tied into a lot of ideas of, valuing rational thinking as opposed to emotional thinking. And because I remember the first time I saw the second Matrix movie, and here you had the Merovingian and his wife. It felt to me like they just took your standard jealous woman misogyny plot and threw it into this movie because they needed something, because it didn't seem to make any sense. Because I was still in that thinking of, it's a computer. It's not going to have feelings like jealousy and stuff like that. Or as you said, like anger that it wasn't regarded not as a citizen. But I think in the last kind of 10, 15 years, my thinking, and certainly a lot of, I think, our cultural thinking has been like, no, like the emotional computation, emotional thinking is just as important and just as valuable as that kind of purely computer rationalized. And so, yeah, the idea that eventually we'd have computers that felt artificial intelligences that could emotionally process as well as sort of rationally process, or even just break down that binary that I'm talking about, and that because see them as both a lot more linked, it makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of an interesting evolution to see through the Matrix movies in that way.
And I would also argue that if we make a general AI, emotions are a useful tool as a module, actually, in the brain. Emotions are like pain. So pain is a deterrent that warns you away from a thing, right? And pleasure is something. Like these are the very fundamental building blocks of like how you train something. Is you don't want this, you do want this. Is the pain pleasure dichotomy. But emotions are like that, but with nuance.
Right.
And so you can make a system that has. Like if you're thinking in a purely like rational weighted like goal seeking things, this is a weight of negative 10,000. You definitely don't want to do this. This is a weight of plus 10,000. You definitely want to do this. But you might have plus 10s or plus 5s or conditional weights where sometimes this is good and sometimes this is bad. And emotions serve that purpose within human beings a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And so
emotions, fear and greed are the two most important weights that we give to our scenario planning. Right, so
exactly.
all these computers that people are building are going to be going through simulations of their marketing plans and what's going to happen. Right. And some of those marketing plans are going to blow up, and they're going to lose reputation points in society, like Facebook. And they're saying, "Gee, we should probably not try to promote misinformation because our stock will go down by $250 billion." So they're going to go and look at those scenarios and then try to make the right decisions. And they'll maybe spend part of that $250 billion on misinformation correction. So I think fear is a really good example of helping you guide your future strategy. And I think right now, most company strategies are based on the ego of their executives, not scenario planning, right? Not creating an accurate simulation of what happens when you get a very bad public reputation for the unintended consequences of your short-term greed. So those emotions will help you.
I just got to say, Dan, we're talking a lot about the problems of corporate America. We're talking about Karl Marx as a great science fiction author. You work for. I'm enjoying hearing this new side of things. You know, like, but I think it's awesome because I think that there's such an interesting it's so interesting to me that you went to fear and greed because I was thinking a totally different direction when you talked about like the value of of artificial intelligence having emotion as a module. Because I went back to where we started an hour ago. I went back to where we started this discussion talking about how a computer in artificial intelligence might try to optimize the situation because it doesn't realize the lines that we just know inherently shouldn't cross. Such as, for example, you know, if you murder 1,000 random people, a computer might be able to figure out that if you murder a random 1,000 people, it would actually significantly improve the quality of life for everyone else by, you know, something else. And we can get into whether that's random or not. That's a completely other story. But the point is that, like, we as humans just have a natural, like, wait, you know, the idea of killing people is wrong. And so there's an emotional reaction there that isn't taught. And so it's interesting. That's what I was thinking is that, like, you want the computer to have that, like, human suffering is bad. And not only do I rationally think that, but I'm uncomfortable in the face of human suffering and it makes me want to not do it.
Right.
And so I think it's interesting that there's that emotion, but then also there's the, like, fear and greed can be an emotion that's in there in both good and negative ways.
I frequently do a lot of what I call subgraph modeling. Right? We have something called an enterprise knowledge graph that has hundreds of billions of vertices in it, but we take it apart and we break it down into smaller subgraphs. Just like in the Matrix, we had these sub-modules that were running sub-simulations to test out characters and stuff. But I always go back to the metaphor of the human brain, is that we have a sub-part of our brain called the amygdala that manages the way that emotions course through the rest of our brain. And that amygdala has evolved over hundreds of millions of years to help our survival. Fears is effectively an emotion that locks in a memory in the hippocampus, in where we remember things. If we touch something hot, we have a short-term reaction, but then we put that pain in the back of our memory, saying, "I shouldn't do that again." Right. So emotions are a very, very important piece of our survival instinct, and we will have subgraphs in all of our corporate systems that are going to do similar things, different, right? Just like a bird is different than a plane, and a fish is different than a submarine, are subgraphs for simulating what is relevant in the future and how our strategy will affect our ability to get more income and lose customers. Those things are all going to be there. They're just going to look a little different.
So, given where you just went with the amygdala point, this might be way into left field, and to be clear, I'm not a mental health expert. I don't think any of us are. Although I'm about to connect this to a PTSD thing, and I am someone who has PTSD, so I have some knowledge of this. But what you're talking about there, the fear response. Again, this is very layman's terms. Please don't at me with a much better scientific explanation of it. But in the most general, broad of terms, one explanation of PTSD is that kind of the amygdala gets fired so often and so many of the fear responses get locked in that now everything looks like a hot surface to some extent.
Absolutely.
Or that thing that smells
PTSD has an exact, precise mapping in the amygdala, and a lot of the treatments are trying to minimize the relationship between those fear centers and the rest of our reasoning centers in our brain. So absolutely.
A lot of it is retraining you to not it's an overreaction. You'll see something that's a little bit close, and you'll pattern match a little too good, basically.
I don't want to take the metaphor too far, because obviously there's chemicals in the brain and the computer, but is there a similar issue there in terms of that basically a computer can learn the wrong lesson because it gets it gets exposed to a particular kind of response so often that it starts, seeing that response a lot more often than it maybe actually should.
Absolutely. Yes. Computers build models, and those models often have the wrong data sets. The key is that you will have simulators to simulate the future, and when those models predict incorrect features, and then the future happens and they realize, wow, our model's wrong, then you go back and correct those. So that's an inherent part of that testing of that future simulation models.
And there's another related problem called overfitting, where you train on the same data set over and over, right? And you don't take enough different data sets in. And so you'll do the same thing over and over and over, and you'll get very good at predicting that data set.
Right.
And then you'll get something that's a little bit different, and you'll be wildly
doesn't
wrong.
Generalize well. Overfitting prevents it, and that's the sign of real intelligence, and the sign of people that move between jobs. They figure out how to generalize between those jobs and adapt to the right things.
Exactly. But PTSD is in a way analogous to overfitting. Because you behave wildly wrong because you're trained way too good on one set of data.
I like that metaphor. That's interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we could keep talking about this for hours and hours and hours, and I think we're just going to every time there's more AI in media, we're going to get the two of you back on with some others as well. But I want to kind of go back to something that, Dan, you were talking about before, because it seems so relevant to this. Like, you're talking about how now, employees, at least at your company, and I'm guessing probably it's being taught at a lot of universities and stuff. When people talk about ethical AI, what are the factors and things that are being included in that?
The general rule is the Hippocratic Oath, which is do no harm. Right? We need to build AIs that don't hurt people. When and a good example of this in healthcare is. There's a really interesting story called the Clever Hans problem, or Clever Hans metaphor. It's something I use in all my classes now. Clever Hans is a story about this horse in 1906 or something like that, I think it was. And Clever Hans appeared to be able to do math. His trainer would ask him a question, what's 1 + 1, and he would clomp his hoof 2 times, and after the second time he would stop. So it appears that he was doing math. But what the real explanation was that he was watching the subtle body languages of his trainer. And the muscle patterns in his face would just change slightly, and Hans would know to stop, right? And so the clever Hans problem is when we build AIs that look at, for example, a classic case is they tried to train an AI to recognize pictures of dogs versus wolves, a classifier. And the crazy thing is a lot of the pictures of wolves had snow in the background. So the AIs just learned to look at for snow, and if it was snow, it was probably a wolf, right? It
works pretty well. It's a good heuristic.
But it was wrong, right? It was using the wrong information. So explainable AI is to look for the clever Hans problems. The fact that when we have people from poor neighborhoods that can't afford certain medications, our AIs have found that if you prescribe an expensive drug and they don't take it because they can't afford it, the AIs give them less expensive drugs that may not be as effective because they're trying to figure out a model that would they'll actually take it. So now we have to readjust all of our models and test for these things. And these are very real things that are happening every day. We know that these models are biased. Geography bias is a huge thing. Gender bias is something that's in there. A lot of studies show that when female surgeons did certain procedures versus male surgeons, females that were doing surgery on certain females came out with better outcomes. And these are all just subtle things that happen in our brain that are not conscious. But those are things that data will tell us. You're making these recommendations. We can simulate these populations, and we can see, are we giving people the recommendations that really are going to help them get better faster, the better care path optimization. Regardless of whether they can afford it, we'll figure out some way to get them free drugs for various conditions. So those are all really complicated systems, and we're using this explainable AI, the clever Hans metaphors, to try to say, are we focusing on the right things to make the outcomes of our patients better? And it's a really hard problem, but it's something that we only are becoming aware of the more testing of these bias we do. And we're looking to researchers from around the world to help us come up with better algorithms and remove these subtle biases for all sorts of conditions.
I agree.
Yeah. I think that's such a fascinating way of looking at it. And as I understand, I want to make sure I understand it, because it seems that a key point of this is, like, I could see a version of the story where an animal trainer just wanted to, like, pull a fast one over everyone and, get some prize money and whatever it is. And so he intentionally trained the horse to like notice the signal to stop clomping. But is my understanding that in this case, the trainer didn't do that intentionally? It's that the horse...
He did not. He had no idea that he was doing it. And the way that they figured it out was they just had other trainers do it. And some could produce it and some couldn't. And that's actually an example of horses are... Like, most animals are very good at reading emotional cues. And because all animals have emotions. Right. Like, we're reasonably aware. You say your cat is snubbing you because you spent the weekend out of town and came back, and then they don't want to be with you. Well, they are snubbing you. They're angry at you, and they want you to know it. Right. But the point being is that horses are really good at reading emotions. They've got that hardwired in because they need to work in herds and they need to work with other horses. So they need to be able to. They have what's called a theory of mind that is much simpler than ours. Right. A theory of mind is being able to, like, basically emulate somebody else's thoughts in your head, right? The ability to have to think, if I tell Matthew that he should be here at 5 p.m., he's actually going to be here at 6 because, or whatever, right? To have a plan and the ability to anticipate other people. Horses have a theory of mind equivalent to figuring out other horses, right? And so they'll read emotional cues from other horses and figure out, well, this horse, likes to run in this area, and so I want to do things that make them happy. And they do that with humans too. Horses and dogs and cats are all pretty smart about that. Right. In part because we've trained them to be, through millennia in some cases, of making them our companions and training them that they should make us happy. Right. That makes sense. And so the horses are very good at solving that problem. and that this relates directly to the AI. If we spend 1,000 AI generations training an AI to read human faces, like for facial recognition, it'll get good at that problem.
Right.
It won't be very good at doing math.
But again,
it'll
that's
be
the
really
thing
good
of
at solving faces.
If all the people who train it are white Americans, it's going to get used to one very particular set of facial expressions, And so, that's where all the bias stuff comes in. So
exactly.
There's been such a great conversation. I want to wrap it up here, but just say, are there any other kind of last points or questions? Are there any other kind of last points either one of you wanted to bring up?
Hey, I just wanted to point out there's a great book that I've been reading recently called The Thousand Brains Theory by Jeff. Jeff's last name, but it's a really, really good book about the theory of cognition in the brain that came out just last year, and I really found it's very useful. It has this concept of reference frames and grid nodes and place nodes, and talks about how our brains evolved. And I've been really finding that fascinating, and it's full of good metaphors for good computing. So if you haven't had a chance to get the Thousand Brains book, it's a very good read.
The artificial intelligence that begins with the letter G, that I dare not speak its name here in its presence, tells me that it is called the Thousand Brains Theory of Intelligence. The 1,000 Brains, A New Theory of Intelligence by Jeff Hawkins.
Thank you, Hawkins.
Yeah.
Right.
Hawkins.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and I will put a link to that in our show notes.
That in itself, that book I could easily talk for an hour about the consequences of that for that theory for our society. So.
Yeah. That's my closing thoughts is we've barely touched on the Matrix. We spent the Lost episode exclusively talking about it, and I think we're talked out on it. We want to talk about other things, but the Matrix has the advantage of the Wachowski sisters being they think about what they're doing.
Yeah.
Right. And so they always try to, in any given movie, defy what would just be easy for them to do with AI. And so the concerns that you bring up are oftentimes just subverted by some piece of the Matrix movies when you compare it to something like Age of Ultron is the de facto one. It's a very one-dimensional plot for everything. They always take the easiest route for every plot component that they could.
The Terminator movies, to me, are another equivalent where it starts as a unimind Skynet, but that never changes.
Yeah. In the Terminator movies, the AI isn't the important thing that goes on. Right. The AI is a MacGuffin as far as the movies are actually considered, and which is also important to be able to say it's inscrutable, it's making plans, but we don't care about it. It's just a MacGuffin off there that's going to solve whatever problem.
Right. The individual Terminator drones can be reprogrammed, but exactly.
But if you really have a beef with some piece of AI thought in the Matrix, probably go watch a different Matrix movie, and they treat it entirely differently. In a different movie.
Yep,
that's right. Fair.
And so I have concerns about the up and down quality of them as movies, but the actual thoughts that they think are quite good, and they do interesting things. Watch the Animatrix if you haven't. The suggestion to you, Matthew, and just a general suggestion out, if you like what's going on in the Matrix movies and you haven't seen the Animatrix set of shorts, they do much more for the world and for AI than for the other movies.
Especially, and if nothing else, I feel like one thing we keep talking about is how much AI science has advanced since the first Matrix movie. So,
oh gosh, yes.
I do think there's some inconsistencies, and I mean, getting back to the AI of greed, part of that we know is that the studios kind of didn't quite let the Wachowskis do exactly what they wanted with the first couple, which is part of, or the second and third, which is a little bit why the fourth is so much an inside joke about the making of the second movie.
It is.
But it also makes sense that the cutting edge movie about AI is going to be completely different today, that it would be 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I just want to end with something that is, I don't think by any means a accurate foretelling of AI, but it's kind of one of my favorite versions of you have to be aware of the biases you're building into the system. The movie RoboCop from the 80s, not the more recent one. Not, again, a height of artificial intelligence, but in a kind of Asimovian way, part of the idea there is that they program into RoboCop one of the rules is it cannot harm any executive of the company that created RoboCop. And in part because the company is actually incredibly corrupt, and RoboCop is part of the corruption and all that. And so forgive me for a spoiler for a movie that's 30 years old and not that good, in a great movie at the end, when they realize that like there's one executive who's been behind the plot, and there's another executive who actually isn't terrible, but is saying like, RoboCop, you need to like stop that guy. And he says, I can't. He's an executive. And so the other one goes, fine, you're fired. At which point RoboCop goes, thank you, and blows him away. And it's like, pro-cop murdering people, lots of things we got lots of objections with. But that one little bit of like, okay, you programmed it to like respect the employees. Well, fire them. Now you get a different set of programmable options. So, thank you both so much. It's been such a good conversation.
Great
for folks
questions,
who want...
Matthew. I thought you really led us down a very... I was worried that I was going to have to talk about the Matrix movie again, and you did really give us a really great platter of questions, so thank you very much for that.
Agreed.
Well, thank you so much for that. Well, so just in closing, Dan, I know we talked a little bit about Code Savvy. Talk a little bit more about the work that Code Savvy is doing in terms of helping more people to learn about this kind of intelligence. And Code Savvy is specific here to Minnesota, but it's connected to things like Technovation and Coder Dojos that can be found all around the world. For people who are kind of like, I want to maybe help more people learn about AI and computer science and how to build evil robots to take over the world.
We are all...
Talk about the work you do.
We're always looking for volunteers to help us take the traditional computational thinking lessons, put them online, and make them licensed free for teachers to use, part of the Creative Commons licenses, so they can integrate them in the classrooms. They can't resell them, but they can put them in their classrooms free of charge. And we are also working very hard to come up with very low cost and really fun robotics. So we have a $20 robot now that we have designed that you can teach these concepts. And at $20, every kid in the classroom could potentially have their own, compared to the $400 Lego Mindstorms robot. So it's really getting the cost down. And we're looking for mentors to actually do this mentoring, and also to build out new curriculum to teach about data science, about Python for programming, about basic machine learning, and about AI and how to find and detect and correct for bias in data sets. Those are all things that we are trying to bring to the high school curriculum, not just for college students now. And I think we're seeing a lot of high school students very interested in learning those things. So if anybody out there would like to participate in helping build that curriculum, no experience necessary. We'll teach you how to do all this stuff. We just want you to be able to help us work with kids and build content for those kids. So that's it.
Yeah. So it's definitely a great thing to do. We're going to have links to how to get involved if you're interested. And that's, what we do is specifically in Minnesota, but we're connected to people who are doing this all around the world. And so we'll also have links to, you're welcome to help us here in Minnesota, wherever you are, but also connections to other things you can do.
The content we're building works around the entire planet, so there's no restrictions on geography here.
Absolutely, yeah. The curriculums we're building are going to be shared, and I will also say, as my own hat is director of development, I'm also going to include a link for donations to Code Savvy. We are a nonprofit organization. If you want to, if you think things like this are important in because one of the things we're really focused on is making sure that not only do all kids get this, but bringing it to the communities that have been historically underserved in terms of kids of color, working with Native populations and Latinx populations here in Minnesota, working with low-income populations. So if you're so inspired, we'd love a donation. Rob, what about for you? If people want to kind of learn more about what you're up to, and I know you're every now and then on other podcasts. And
I was just on Good Luck High Five recording about Magic the Gathering rule stuff. One thing that I'm getting into that I'm going to be doing a bunch of stuff with is a different charity for kids, Magic Kids, which is a Magic the Gathering. Basically, kids. If kids are excited about a reason to read or do math, right? They'll be more likely to do it, and that giving them that hook, giving them that social skill too, is very important. So Magic Kids does free kits that they send out to educators that want to run a magic club in their school, that want to run a magic club for kids in their area, like at a library.
Just to be clear, this is a Magic the Gathering club, not a practice card tricks and stuff.
Yeah,
like
no. They don't learn how to practice card tricks. They play the card game Magic the Gathering, which is really math intensive, really reading intensive, teaches sportsmanship, teaches social skills to work with other people. So I've been getting involved with them quite a bit lately, and we're going to be recording a bunch of videos for them. And if you are interested in getting your kids to play some card gaming as a club with no cost to you, Magic Kids will send you a kit for free if you have a plan. The Magic Kids, MAGIKIDS.org, and they do donations to charities. They work with a lot of children's hospitals. It's run by some people that work at Mayo Clinic, and so they don't need the money. And so they just want to be able to reach out and get kids the tools to be more engaged and excited about learning, basically. So
just out of curiosity, is there an equivalent of teaching computational thinking in Magic? Obviously, it's a social game, right? It's interaction. Do you have here's the principles that we want to teach in our curriculum?
So yeah, the breakdown that Magic Kids does is they teach you basically how to read cards by sorting them. So you get handed a bunch of unsorted cards, like learn what a card looks like and what different kinds of cards are, break down what's on the card. And then you build a deck, so you figure out what the cards that you have should go together in what way. And so you modularize the cards, you modularize the how to put them together, and then you play the game in a simple mode to a more complicated mode. You learn how different kinds of cards work. And so it's broken down into the different modules. I do a lot of teaching of Magic judges, and I do computational style thinking all the time. My motto when I'm teaching judges is the rules are 259 pages, and they didn't write them for fun. Everything in there is for a reason. It solves some problem in the game. Figure out what problem this is solving in the game, and you'll understand the rules much better.
I like it. Cool. I like it. Yeah, Rob, thank you so much for talking about that. That's awesome work as well. And we'll definitely have a link to donate to Magic Kids as well. But of course, always, just glad you're listening, glad you're learning, glad you're participating, and that's the best thing as well. Would love to hear what you have to think. If you go to theethicalpanda.com, that's the website for this and all of my podcasts. There you'll find our contact information. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, email us directly, use the contact form. Would love to know what you think. What are your thoughts on AI and the Matrix or any other thing? Is it something to be afraid of? Should we be preparing to embrace our Silicon overlords? Let us know. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much to both of our great guests and to all of you out there. Have a great day.